There is a particular kind of silence that follows a woman who has learned not to speak unless she means it. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. Not the silence of someone who is afraid. The silence of someone who has already said everything that mattered once, in a place where words cost lives, and has since decided that most conversations in the ordinary world are simply not worth the breath they borrow. Margaret Calloway carried that silence with her the way other people carry old photographs. Close, worn smooth from handling, invisible to anyone who hadn't lost something the same way she had. She was 41 years old. She ran a small firearms training range on the eastern edge of a valley in rural Colorado, the kind of valley where the mountains don't inspire you so much as they remind you how small you are. The range sat on 11 acres of flat, wind-scrubbed land her grandfather had left her. There was a main shed, a covered shooting lane with 8 positions, a small office that smelled permanently of gun oil and old coffee, and a hand-painted sign at the entrance that read CALLOWAY Precision, Training and Consultation. She had no employees. She had a rescue dog named Duster who slept under the front desk and occasionally lifted one ear at the sound of distant shots before deciding they weren't worth the effort. She had a truck with 170,000 miles on it and a cracked dash she'd never gotten around to fixing. She woke every morning at 5, made coffee, sat on the back porch in the cold and watched the mountains turn from black to purple to gray to gold, and she breathed, and she did not think about Afghanistan, and she did not think about the valley near Kunar province where her spotter had died, and she did not think about the 18 months she had spent in a VA hospital learning to live in a body that had forgotten how to stop being at war. She thought about the coffee. She thought about what needed doing that day. She thought about Duster, who needed his hip medication and whose warm weight against her leg in the morning was the most honest thing in her world. That was Margaret's life, and she had made peace with most of it. The call came on a Tuesday in late October, through a contact she hadn't heard from in 3 years, a former intelligence liaison named Bowman, who had the phone manner of someone reading from a script he didn't believe in. He told her there was a joint training exercise being run about 60 miles north, a combination of active-duty Navy SEALs and a civilian advisory unit the government was testing a new evaluation model with. They needed a long-range marksmanship instructor for 3 days, specifically someone who could assess performance under pressure scenarios in high-altitude terrain. She didn't want to go. She told him she was booked. He told her she wasn't because he'd checked. There was a long pause on the line. She looked at Duster. Duster looked back. She said yes. Mostly because November was coming and the range bookings were thin, and the propane bill was not. She drove up the mountain road the following Thursday morning with her rifle case in the bed of the truck and 2 thermoses of coffee on the passenger seat. The road was unpaved for the last 8 miles, winding through pine forest so dense the sky disappeared for long stretches. And the truck complained on every switchback in a language of groans and shifting gravel. The base camp was a collection of military green tents and prefabricated structures set at the edge of a high meadow, maybe 9,000 feet up, with a ridgeline running north and a long, descending slope to the south that gave way to a river canyon far below. The air had teeth at that altitude. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. There were 14 men already assembled when she pulled in. She could see them from the truck before she stepped out. They were all built the way that kind of man gets built, layered with muscle and a certain aggressive ease. The way people look when physical difficulty has become normal and they've stopped performing it. They stood in clusters, talking, checking gear. Several of them glanced at her truck when it came to a stop. A few looked at her when she stepped out. She was not tall. She was not particularly striking. She wore a canvas jacket over a thermal base layer, worn jeans, and boots that had survived 3 different countries. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. She moved without hurry across the gravel toward the logistics tent, her rifle case in one hand, her second thermos in the other. She heard one of them say something. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, the laughter that followed it, the way the sound curved, light and dismissive in her direction. She had heard that tone before, in Ramstein, in Fort Bragg, in the hallways of the VA. She had long since stopped trying to identify the specific words. The tone was enough. It said, "You are out of place here." It said, "We are the serious ones and you are the footnote." She walked to the tent, introduced herself to the logistics officer, signed the paperwork, and received her 3-day brief. She did not explain herself to anyone. She did not offer her service history or her qualifications unprompted. She set up her position at the assessment table near lane 7, poured coffee from her thermos, and waited for the morning to begin. The exercise was structured in 3 phases. Phase 1 was a baseline assessment, standard marksmanship at fixed distances, 400 to 800 meters, calm conditions. Phase 2 introduced wind and elevation variables. Phase 3 was a simulated live ambush scenario in the canyon below the ridge, moving targets, partial concealment, compressed time windows. The SEALs were good. There was no other honest way to put it. They moved through Phase 1 with the kind of disciplined efficiency that comes from years of actual consequence, real rounds in real places, real decisions with real weight behind them. Several of them were excellent shooters. One of them, a man named Rurk, was exceptional, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that only some of them are quiet, watchful. He shot a sub-MOA group at 600 meters in a crosswind and barely looked at the target afterward. Margaret noted everything on her clipboard. She asked precise questions. She offered no praise and no criticism in that phase, just observation, and that absence of reaction seemed to unsettle some of them more than any comment would have. During the lunch break, she sat apart at the edge of the meadow and ate a sandwich and looked at the ridgeline and thought about angles. She was calculating the canyon terrain from the topo maps she'd studied the night before, running numbers in the back of her mind the way other people hum songs without knowing they're doing it. Wind patterns at this altitude in late October, the way sound would move in the canyon below, the way the light would sit by mid-afternoon when the Phase 3 scenario was scheduled to begin. 2 of the men walked past her and one of them said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Is she going to shoot or just watch?" And the other one said something back that she didn't bother tracking. She took another bite of her sandwich. Duster was not here to look at, so she looked at the mountains instead, which were equally honest and equally unbothered. Phase 3 began at 2:15 in the afternoon. The scenario was a simulated convoy ambush in the lower canyon, a realistic enough setup with role players positioned along the opposite ridge, using blank-fire weapons and electronic scoring sensors. The SEALs were to move through the canyon in 2 elements, while a support fire position on the near ridge engaged targets of opportunity to suppress the simulated ambush. The support position was where Margaret was assigned. She set up 230 meters above the canyon floor, behind a natural rock outcropping that gave her a fractured but workable sight line across the width of the ravine. The wind at the ridge was variable, coming southwest at around 12 miles per hour, gusting to 18, with a canyon effect that would push and pull the air in unpredictable angles as it funneled between the rock walls below. Temperature was dropping. The light was beginning its long late afternoon lean, throwing shadows across the opposite face of the canyon, at an angle that made range estimation complicated for anyone who hadn't accounted for it in advance. She had accounted for it in advance. She settled behind her rifle. She breathed. The familiar weight of the stock against her shoulder was not comfort. Exactly. It was more like a language she had not spoken in a long time but had never actually forgotten. The cold seeped through her jacket at the elbows where they pressed the rock. The wind moved her hair where it escaped the collar of her jacket. Below, the exercise began. Two SEAL elements moved into the canyon from the south. The role players activated their simulated ambush from three positions on the north ridge. One elevated, one mid-slope, one near the canyon floor behind a boulder cluster. The exercise controller's voice came through her earpiece. Support position is live. Scenario is running. She did not move for 4 seconds. She was reading the wind, the angle of the first target's movement, the distance. Her laser rangefinder had already told her the boulder cluster was 680 meters, the mid-slope position 611, the elevated position 742. She had already adjusted her scope. She had already calculated the wind holds. There was nothing left to do but be still and then not be still. Her first shot broke the silence of the entire canyon. It was a sound like the world clearing its throat, short, definitive, absolute. The electronic sensor on the elevated role player registered a hit. Dead. Out of the scenario. 742 meters, crosswind, declining angle, in under 5 seconds from the start of the simulated ambush. Below in the canyon, movement paused. Both SEAL elements hesitated, involuntarily, the way trained men sometimes do when something doesn't match their expectation of how events are supposed to unfold. She was already moving to the second position. The wind shifted. She felt it on her face before the grass confirmed it. She adjusted, held, squeezed. Second shot, 611 meters. Mid-slope position, hit. Role player raised his hands. Out, 7 seconds into the ambush. 2 of 3 simulated ambush positions were gone. The canyon floor target was moving now, ducking behind additional cover, which was within the rules of the exercise, but which also meant he was exactly where the terrain forced him to be. She had seen that on the topo map the night before. She had seen it in her mind during lunch while the two men walked past and made their comment. She put her crosshairs 4 inches ahead of the movement, accounted for the canyon wind funnel, and waited one single breath. Third shot. 690 meters, moving target, partial concealment, canyon wind effect. Hit. The exercise controller's voice came through the earpiece again, and this time it was not the flat procedural tone of someone running a timed test. There was something else in it. A pause first, like he needed to check whether his sensor data was accurate. Then, all 3 ambush positions are down, 14 seconds from scenario start. Support position confirmed 3 for 3. Below in the canyon, nothing moved for a long moment. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recalibration. 14 men who had spent years developing the ability to assess threats and capabilities were suddenly, quietly, doing exactly that, reassessing. Rourke was the first one to look up toward the ridge. She could see him from her position, his face turned upward, scanning the rock line. He couldn't see her specifically. She was behind cover, prone, wearing muted earth colors against gray stone. But he looked up the way a man looks when he understands that the answer to something important is in a direction he hadn't been watching. The debrief happened an hour later in the main tent. Around a folding table with paper cups of bad coffee and the particular flat lighting of temporary military structures that makes everyone look tired regardless of how they actually feel. The exercise controller walked through the scenario timeline. He pulled up the sensor data on a laptop and turned it so the assembled men could see the 3 timestamps. The first shot, 4.8 seconds after scenario initiation. The second, 7.1 seconds. The third, 14.2. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the men, not Rourke, One of the others, one who had been in the cluster that morning when she first pulled in, said, "What's the distance on the third one?" The controller said, 690. Moving canyon wind. Another silence. A different kind from the one in the canyon. This one had weight to it, the physical weight of something that needed to be revised. Rourke was looking at her. Not in the way men sometimes look at a woman in a room of men, not measuring, not assessing for the ordinary reasons. He was looking at her the way a professional looks at someone who has just shown them something they had genuinely not seen before, and he was trying to understand it, not dismiss it, understand it. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. She didn't smile. She didn't offer anything explanatory. She had nothing to explain. He looked down at the table and then back up and said, "Where did you develop your long-range capability?" The question landed on the table between them like something placed carefully. She let it sit there for a second before she answered. She said, "Kunar Province, 2009 through 2012, and then again in 2014. The room absorbed that. Kunar Province in those years was not a reference that needed annotation for men who knew what those years had held in that particular valley. The terrain, the distances, the specific and brutal difficulty of sniper work in that altitude and those conditions. Rourke said, "What unit?" She said the designation quietly, without drama, the way you say the name of a place you lived for a long time, matter-of-factly, because it doesn't need inflation. The man who had asked about the distance put his paper cup down on the table slowly. Another man across the tent shifted in his folding chair and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. She reached into the inside pocket of her canvas jacket and placed a single photograph on the table. She had carried it without knowing she was going to use it today, the way you sometimes carry something for years before you understand why you kept it. It was a photograph of a two-person team on a rock face in bad light. You couldn't see much. Both figures in full gear, but the conditions visible in the frame were unmistakable to anyone who had been in that particular terrain. The elevation, the specific shape of the rock, the angle of the Kunar Valley floor far below. She had been the one on the left. She slid the photograph back into her pocket after a moment. She hadn't shown it as proof. She'd shown it because something in the room required the truth to have a physical object behind it, something real to hold the weight of what was being understood. Rourke looked at where the photograph had been on the table for a moment after she put it away. Then he looked at her. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him steadily. She said, "It wasn't you." "No," he said, "but I heard it and I didn't say anything. That's the same." She held his gaze. In another life, in the life she sometimes thought about at 5 in the morning on the back porch, the version of herself that hadn't learned to put things down. She might have said something sharp here, something with edges. But she had driven 80 miles up a mountain and shot 3 of 3 in 14 seconds, and she was warm now with bad coffee. And the mountains were outside turning colors she couldn't see from here but knew were there. And she was tired of carrying the edges of other people's failures to recognize things accurately. She said, "Then don't do it again." He nodded. It was the slow, considered nod of a man who means it. She drove back down the mountain on the last evening of the exercise with the heater running, and the dark coming fast from the east, and the headlights cutting through the pine tunnel of the road in long yellow sweeps. Her rifle case was in the bed of the truck again. Her thermos was empty. The mountains on either side of the valley were shapes she knew well enough that she didn't need to see them clearly to understand where she was. She thought about the canyon. She thought about the 14 seconds. She thought about Rourke's face when he looked up from the canyon floor, the specific quality of that look. A man understanding something true, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not vindication exactly. Vindication implies you were waiting for something. She had stopped waiting a long time ago. It was closer to recognition. The thing that happens when a truth that has always existed stops being invisible. It doesn't change the truth. The truth was never in doubt. But there is something, some small, human, exhausted something, that shifts in you when the world finally sees what you always knew was there. She thought about her grandfather's land, the hand-painted sign, Duster's hip, and the medication she needed to give him when she got home, and the specific warmth of his weight against her leg in the cold morning. She thought about the mountains near Kunar province, which she could not see from here and would never go back to, and which nevertheless lived somewhere in the back of her chest, in a place that breathing couldn't always reach. She thought about her spotter. His name had been Dominic, and he had been 26 years old, and he had been from a small town in Louisiana, and he had laughed easily, which she had always found remarkable in that place. In those years, she didn't think about him for long. She had learned to visit and then return. There are women, and most of them you will never know, who have held the line in places that don't appear in the stories that get told. They were not loud about it. They did not hold a press conference on the ridgeline. They breathed, and they held still, and they let the truth of what they were capable of exist quietly in the dark until the moment it was necessary, and then they showed it simply, without flourish. The way you show a fact. They came home to ordinary lives afterward, to cracked dashboards and rescue dogs and hand-painted signs, to 5 o'clock mornings with cold coffee and mountains that don't need anything from you and won't give you anything either, but will stand there, which is sometimes the most honest company available. The world will sometimes look at a quiet woman and see a footnote. It will make its assumptions in the space where her explanation would have been if she had chosen to offer one. It will laugh the small, careless laugh of something that doesn't know what it's looking at, and she will let it. Because she has learned, the way you only learn certain things in certain places at real cost, that the truth does not require permission to be true. It just requires, sometimes, one shot. And 14 seconds, and a canyon deep enough to carry the sound of something being permanently, irreversibly understood.